with the record. And I am happy to welcome you all to our first seminar for this year. We took a little break, and traditionally our seminars are held by the Department of International Relations in our university, the International Laboratory on World Order Studies and New Regionalism, and of course the Bulgarian Club in our university. My name is Stefan Stoyanov, and I'm a research assistant in the laboratory, and also I am the chairman of the Bulgarian Club. We're going to continue our talks about Europe, about the European Union and policies, because, well, I frankly think that there are always pressing issues on the horizon, and we want to explore them with some of the best Bulgarian experts in their fields. And speaking of best in their fields, without any exaggeration, I'm very glad to welcome our best expert when it comes to the United States and American politics, Her Excellency Elena Poптodorova. She served twice as a Bulgarian ambassador to the United States, and she's also the vice president of the Atlantic Treaty Association. She held the position of spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and also director of the Human Rights and International Humanitarian Organizations Directorate, and also Director of the Security Policy Directorate in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She also was twice elected as a member of the parliament, and she's also a member of the Washington-based Executive Council on Diplomacy and the Women's Foreign Policy Group. She actually has a very long biography. I'm going to stop here, and we're not going to waste any more time. I'm very happy to give the floor to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Stefan. I just want to make sure that we can, I can hear you very well. Do you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, yes, great. Thank you. I think we'll be starting this meeting because it's kind of an encounter, a diplomatic encounter, I would call it, among young people who hopefully will embrace a diplomatic career, and somebody who has spent some time in it. I need probably to apologize for having had to postpone this meeting for some time, for a couple of times, but that was for reasons beyond me. Why I'm mentioning this, because I think everything happens for a reason. I think that today we will probably be able to say a lot more and kind of face a different reality than what we were probably going to talk about last March or last May. Life has become so dynamic, professional life as well, that I think we are now facing a very different situation in Europe and the world, and a very different reality. I would probably need to say a few more words, not that Stefan's introduction was insufficient. Thank you, that was really quite impressive. But I would like to tell you a few words about myself, how I approach our trade, how I approach the whole kind of fascinating world of diplomacy. I should first of all say that I would love a conversation rather than a strict form of lecturing. Secondly, I believe it's only fair to give you my outlook to the topic we shall be discussing. I'm proud to be Bulgarian, I'm proud to be a European, and I'm proud to be a transatlanticist. Because these three characteristics, they go very well together, and nothing is at the expense of the other. I'm saying this because we shall actually be touching on a very sensitive matter as far as Bulgaria is concerned. And probably we Bulgarians are an exception to other fellow member states of the European Union. most notably Romania, Poland, the Baltic countries, for a number of both objective reasons, subjective reading of some historical facts as well, and because of objective history and geography. Our topic today is the EU and the US. What is the state of our union? I will begin by saying that we are living in a much more complicated environment than I imagined some 30 years ago when I first embarked on a very uphill at the beginning campaign for making Bulgaria a member of NATO and then a member of the European Union. Today, I think we have again to argue in favor of those two families we belong to. And I'll be mixing up, of course, Bulgarian experiences with some general observations, because I believe I'm also talking to Bulgarian students who will know very well what I'm referring to. Basically, we need to one more time prove the absolute necessity and positive outcome and benefit to Bulgaria as a result of becoming, after a very hard process of negotiating, a member of both families. But since we're talking of the European Union, I'll only limit myself to one remark, and it is that we wouldn't have been able to join the European Union unless we had joined NATO in the first place. And this is why they happened in this successive order. 2004 was NATO membership and 2007 was EU membership. We're witnessing these days, both on the domestic political scene and internationally as well, attempts to plant doubts as to whether the EU has a future, how autonomous, how independent, how sovereign the EU is. Isn't the EU just a puppet of America? And that has become a very powerful kind of line of propaganda, I would call it, especially after the 24th of February, when the war on Ukraine began. And the story about this relationship, EU and USA, is not a simple one. It's not a black and white one, and it does not in any way kind of come down to kind of subordinate position by one and dominant position by the other. And this is why I would like to remind the audience that actually the relationship between Europe and America began as, it must have been much older, but what I'm interested in is the post-Second World War period, after the alliances that were forged during the war, during the Second World War. I'd like to remember and kind of particularly highlight the Marshall Plan, which happened in the late 40s of the past century, when America ran to the rescue of a devastated post-war Europe, when all countries, all European countries, were practically offered the Marshall Plan, including ours, including Bulgaria, and all countries which later became known as the Soviet sphere. Bulgaria kept its response to the offer for 4 days, and then eventually it said no, because that was the political dictum, that was the political order, that it was not supposed, like all the other members of the Warsaw Pact organization, were not allowed to take any assistance coming from the West. But Europe's relationship with the US started in a more structured way at that time. Then, not too many years later, in I believe it was the early 50s, there was an official kind of presence by the United States of America in the first European format, the first European organization, which, as you know very well by now, it was the European Coal and Steel Community. And actually, the first mission of the United States of America was first started in Luxembourg in 1956, while the European Coal and Steel Commission, it opened its own offices in Washington in 1953. So when we talk of relations between the EU and the USA, we should really remember the beginnings, because they were never interrupted ever since. They only grew more intense and broadened, with all ups and downs, of course, and we will mention the ups and downs as well, or the downs if you want to focus on that. The delegation of the European Commission was officially opened in Washington in 1954, and then the Brussels mission of the United States of America opened in 1961. So we can say that we are basically marking almost, not completely, but almost 70 years of diplomatic relations between Europe and the United States of America. Actually, the post-Cold War period really gave an impetus to a more structured development of relations between the two sides of the Atlantic. Back in 1990, the Transatlantic Declaration was adopted, and it formalized this relationship, which was more of a protocol kind of presence on both sides of the ocean. But as of 1990, it started attempting at a more structured relationship. And that was also the beginning of a very regular political dialogue, which we witness to this very day. The regular summits began at that time, which is what, 32 years ago. Of course, they mostly focused on economy, trade, education, science, culture. The sacred sphere of defense and security was never touched until much later. The Madrid summit of 1995 then drafted a very important document, which was the transatlantic agenda, and it outlined 4 rather broad areas of cooperation between Europe and the United States, which was mostly peace and stability, democracy and development was one sphere. The other one was handling global challenges in the world. Yet another one was, of course, trade and economic relations, expanding trade together. And very important, 4th area was building closer ties between the two sides of the Atlantic. Actually, not much later, the joint EU-US action plan was adopted, which further on led, a couple of years later, led to the Transatlantic Economic Partnership. But you would note that actually the focus was mostly on trade and economic ties. And the TEP, the Transatlantic Economic Partnership, actually was meant to avoid obstacles in trade and the mutual recognition of goods and services, tariffs, all of these rather conflictual areas between Europe and the US. Foreign policy is a very specific and complex area. You know that the European Union is working more and more, how should I say, progressively to building, structuring a common foreign policy, foreign and security policy. But given the how should I say, a truism which says that security and foreign policy is the sacred and most intimate part of every nation. It's part of a nation's sovereignty, this is probably the most delicate and the most difficult area to work in and with. This, of course, it proves difficult for the European Union itself, among the European countries themselves, let alone of this relationship in that particular sphere with the US. The EU still doesn't have a fully integrated foreign policy. And hence all the discussions about consensus or consensus -1, this is still an ongoing, very serious debate within the EU when it comes to bringing the countries more closely together. Of course, it becomes even more complicated and more complex when member states do not have a commonly agreed position on a matter, on an issue. And we've had such instances in the past. This is why this remains a very uneven, I would call it, sphere of relations. One of the, speaking of foreign policy, and I'm not yet gone to the security policy, which is even more complicated with all the defense and security issues involved. But there has always been a question, and that became particularly evident a few years ago during President Trump's time, how predictable US foreign policy is. And as I say, this became particularly acute in the period 2017-2021, which was a Trumpian kind of era in US policy in general, but foreign policy in particular. Obviously, a stable relationship of us Europeans with the US demands a stable foreign policy, long-term and predictable foreign policy, which used to be for so many years after the war in particular, it used to be the how should I put it, the badge of America. Whatever they may do, there was always a bipartisan consensus on foreign policy and security matters. It was for the first time betrayed under President Trump, who chose isolationism rather than stronger and more active engagement with the natural ally, and more than an ally, I would call it alter ego, which is the European Union. So I can only remember, because it was not that long time ago, the sigh of relief when all Europeans not only quietly uttered, but also voiced out very loudly when President Biden was elected. Of course, there are all kind of details to be mentioned, all nuances to be mentioned to US elections. Of course, President Biden may not have been the most charismatic leader America has had, but he was, and he has been, he still is, extremely meticulous, conscientious, and hardworking on relations of America with Europe. So this is what happened, and I remember as I say, the official statements, which were immediately published and sent out by European leaders, and Ursula von der Leyen as the Europe leader at that time to begin with. At that time, also the Trade and Technology Council was formed between the European Union and the US, because until very recently, the general relationship between the EU and the US was mostly trade policy itself. It was also tariffs. It was competition. Mostly, it practically focused on the economic sphere, cultural as well, education. But as I said, defense and security was all left out to be catered by NATO, regardless of an obvious fact that the same prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers who were sitting in the Brussels conference rooms for EU discussions and EU meetings would only change buildings to go into NATO meetings. So this is another very important specifics that needs to be pointed out. And it has become even more valid with the latest accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. So we can, especially after the midterm election, as I say, we can feel pretty, or fairly, okay, not completely, but fairly confident that the US is back in its usual business of having a consensus foreign policy with regard to the critical issues of international peace, security, and defense. And although the Republicans have taken over Congress with a very lean, very thin majority, still until now, excluding the Trumpian extreme of the Republican Party, the two parties have managed to behave in a bipartisan fashion with regard to the big issues of the day, international issues of the day, I mean. It is not surprising that trade should occupy a big portion of the political attention of Europe and America. When you come to think of it, the EU and the US share among themselves 60% of the global GDP, 33% of the world trade, and another 42% of world services, of global services. So can you imagine the power, the potential of such a Euro-Atlantic bloc, which has behaved as one so far, as I say, with all due disagreements on practical matters, but generally with as a general political philosophy of staying together, sticking together in the world. So there have been a number of trade conflicts, lawsuits, especially having to do with competition and trade tariffs. But when you look at the numbers, compared to the overall numbers, the overall volume, it's only 2% of the global trade volume that would go to court or to look for any kind of a legal solution. Immediately after the election of no, that was earlier. I'm sorry. It was much earlier. It was before Trump, when the Transatlantic Economic Council was established. Because it is true that even before Trump, there was another kind of sequence of US presidents who did realize, did appreciate the importance of that transatlantic bond. So the Transatlantic Economic Council was established, and that was back in 2007, which unfortunately did not deliver according to expectations and hopes. Obviously, the reason is that, the reason being that there is a fair degree of protectionism applied on both sides. Well, now, much later, the TTIP was launched, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which also had its ups and downs. And the idea was, again, to regulate more smoothly trade relations between Europe and the US. Which is kind of, how should I put it? It's gets to the fore of the attention. It gets all the effort by both Europeans and Americans. Then it will kind of be forgotten or left on hold, put on hold. So that's another area where work needs to be done. An area where both Europe and America have discovered they need each other and they work to develop closer ties. This is energy and sustainability. Again, before the latest developments and until Europe was still heavily dependent on Russian sources of energy, there was a totally different view of Europe's own energy policy. But last May, with the adoption of a new energy program, re-energize Europe, it's a totally different outlook, totally different view of how energy diversification and energy supply in general should happen. And then, of course, ties intensified very rapidly, mostly in terms of LNG, of liquefied natural gas, which America has in plenty, and which serious amounts of it were transported to Europe and will probably also be negotiated in the near and midterm future. There were divisive issues, of course, also within the EU itself. I will give you a kind of a clearer example, because more recent examples are still in the making. We may be faced with different situations on a country level. But when we remember the Iraq War, this is probably a kind of an example by the book of how Europe may be divided within as an attitude to an event, to a problem which exists out of Europe itself, but which engages Europe very much. So for the Iraq War, we did have the coalition of the willing. We did have those who opposed the war, which, however, did not destroy Europe. I'm using this example only as a really genuine proof that no matter how tense and strained relations may be among the European countries, EU member states notably, we seem to appreciate very well the benefits of belonging to this union, notwithstanding some shortcomings and some conflict situations that may arise. That was another kind of point of tension with the US, of course, since the Iraq War was the making of practically the the US administration at the time. Climate can be one of those issues. The Kyoto Protocol, which was never ratified by the US Senate, is such a kind of topic of dissent, probably. But I'll tell you right away why, because I was there and I witnessed the debates on climate. They started as early as Clinton, when he pushed forward the climate change as an important policy matter for the US. Then with the Republican administration, it went down the list of priorities. With Obama, again, it went up. But there is, however, with Obama, I remember there was, it was not an easy topic for the Democrats either, because there is one big issue. What do the less developed countries or developing countries do about the requirements of the Kyoto Protocol? And of course, India and China immediately spring to mind. So that can be another matter which may cause differences, but not rifts, not serious rifts in this relationship. Another favorite topic, visas. And Bulgaria here has very strong sentiments about visas, because we can never make this 3% denial rate. And we always go into double digits. So it's not just us, it's also Croatia, it's Cyprus, it's Romania, but we definitely need to make sure that we do get in the visa waiver list. But I'm mentioning this not so much to lament again Bulgaria's unfavorable situation, but to tell you that this is an area of total solidarity within the EU. And several times the issue was raised in Brussels headquarters with the Americans, and there were kind of threats, I would call them, of introducing visa reciprocity with the US until the open issues with these four countries are resolved. Well, of course, it never came to life, because when the analysis is made, it comes out that Europe will be on the losing side if we introduced visas to the Americans. So, but what I'm saying is that they speak up, it's us again, but the officials in Brussels, they do speak up in favor, in support of countries like Bulgaria. Another matter of that was a serious difference of views and a clash even was Nord Stream, the Nord Stream policy of Germany, when America stated right away, and not just one, a couple of administrations, successive administrations, were strongly against. Well, you see what happened. Actually, life came to prove Americans right, and now we know that there is practically a close down on that energy project. What is good news for, and I will probably stop here, because as I told you at the beginning, I would really love a conversation. What is important now, that we have, as the president of the US, a committed transatlanticist. Biden has spent 50 years of his life, of his professional life, in promoting and developing relations with Europe. Blinken, his Secretary of State, has the same reputation. And actually what he did say very early after his being nominated Secretary of State of the US, and what that was consistent with the post-Cold War US foreign policy tradition, that America, the US as administration, as a nation, actually knows that the big goal is a Europe whole, free, prosperous, and at peace. And I would think that this is a goal and thinking, a policy view which totally corresponds to what we Europeans want to ourselves. And I'll stop here, Stefan, and we'll expect more questions to be asked so that we can probe into some very, very, very curious and critical details.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, we already have several questions in the chat section. And we have a hand up. But before we start with the question, I would actually like to ask a question. And let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in the United States. You know, there were the midterm elections, but how can we understand American politics better? Can you make a small playbook for us? And let me paraphrase with an example. The main message of the conservatives, of right journalists after the midterm elections was that the Republicans won the House, the Democrats lost it, so people prefer Republicans. But on the other side, more left journalists and experts, they were saying that, well, these were actually the most successful elections for midterm elections for a sitting president in the past 20 years. So people still prefer Democrats. And those both statements are at some point right and true, but they're controversial. So how can we navigate this situation for ourselves?
You know, Stefan, I'll start with a truism. The devil is in the details. So let's go to the details. Actually, it is almost well, not a written rule, but a practical rule that the party of the sitting president loses the first midterm elections after he had taken office. And this is factually true. There was even a kind of a study made in the US which said that in 19 successive midterm elections, you can multiply by the years that followed. So it's all 19 first-time midterm elections. post-World War II, it's always at the expense of the party of the sitting president. I recall what happened to Obama in 2010. It was devastating. And what I imagined and suspected, actually not imagined, what I suspected was that Biden may not have this dramatic result, this bad result, which Obama had. And obviously this is what happened. And I'll tell you why I was thinking that may happen. I will not conceal my instincts by saying that I hoped it would happen this way, but it's not an American view, it's a European view. It's exactly because of everything I've been telling you until now that I really, really wanted the Republicans to realize that Trump is not their flag. He's not their flagman. So anyways, what happened was that everybody was predicting this red wave, which didn't happen. Why it did not happen? Number one, because obviously the Democrats were very well organized. They just mobilized everything, fearing a loss of a much bigger magnitude. And fearing what, as I said, the unwritten but practical rule is that they would lose big time in this election. So they just went out to vote. And I remember that both Trump and Biden had as their last appeal to their voters, please go out and vote, please vote. They were not even telling them who were they supposed to vote. And that reminds me very much our own situation in Bulgaria. I can hear our different political leaders kind of appealing to people, just go out and vote. And probably this is indeed the first prerequisite to a good result. So the Democrats did go out and vote. Now, in order to understand the result, the rather lean, rather modest victory, let's put it this way, of the Republicans, we should look deeper into what's going on in the Republican Party itself. I think that a division happened between the Trumpists, if I may call them that way, and Reaganites. Because the Republican Party has boasted for many years to be the party of Reagan, Ronald Reagan, who brought so many good things to the Republicans during his term, both in terms of economic policy, but also when Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall. There is legacy that goes with Reagan. And this is what I would imagine the good Republican, who's a family man, a religious man, a man of ethics, because Protestant ethics is something to be admired and to be respected, and that's something which goes with the more with the, let's say, put it this way, more with the Reaganite type of Republicans. So in the meantime, another outrageous thing happened, and this was the assault on the Capitol. On Capitol Hill. This is unforgivable. And it's not just the investigating committee that was started by the Republicans in the House of Trump's responsibility, but it is also the testimonies of his own men. What Vice President Mike Pence had to say, had to share. He was almost murdered on that day out there, only because Trump would not utter a word of restraint to his followers, to just tell them, stay away, stay clean of the Capitol, you're not supposed to be there. He denied to say that. There is a testimony of Ivanka, his daughter, who testimony or transcript at least was made public when she said, listen, you have to say something, you cannot leave this going on. And yet he wouldn't do it because he was desperately insisting on somebody, including Mike Pence, kind of stating that the last election, the last presidential election, was stolen from him. By the way, Mike Pence is coming out with a book which contains some factual material about exchanges, about conversations they've had also on that day, on that 6th of January, which was really critical. Deep down, the Republicans were totally embarrassed, or at least the Reaganite part of Republicans were not just embarrassed, they were appalled, they were horrified that this might happen under a Republican flag. The other thing that happened was that Trump had no success whatsoever with anybody of his so-called fidels, of his loyals, in insisting that they should claim forged results of the election. You remember the story with the governor of Georgia. Do you remember how the Supreme Court denied a lawsuit which he wanted to push, because the Supreme Court of the US is practically has a Trump majority. He was lucky to have the chance to appoint 3 of the Supreme judges. So he thought everything was in order. He had it all. No, the Supreme Court said no to him, the Georgia governor, and that was an amazing example of how decency and integrity are more valid, have more value than partisanship and political loyalty. So all this was happening in the course of the past 2 years, and when finally Trump decided to appear on the campaign trail, the last few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, he would appear at rallies, he would be extremely vocal, he would make speeches, he would endorse very loudly some candidates, and those candidates who were most strongly supported by him, endorsed by him, they practically lost. So that's the explanation why the Republicans lost. This does not mean that the Republican Party does not have the potential. And yeah, they did get the House, but the Senate, it will stay Democrat. 1 or 2 seats, this is still to be decided, but it will stay Democrat. That will not make Biden's life any easier, but at least it won't be this total block, this total, how should I put it, impotence which he would have had if both houses were, both chambers actually were to go to the Republicans. So I think that it's a very kind of an expediency, political expediency that acted in the case of the Republicans, which did not let them have more seats, and on the other hand, helped the Democrats keep whatever they could.
Thank you. And while we are on, while we are talking about Republicans and about Trump, there is actually a question in the chat section regarding to the Republican Party, that there are now a lot of speculations with the name of Ron DeSantis as a future Republican presidential candidate, and how his candidacy would affect the development of the Republican Party itself, and how close his policies would be to Trump's if he becomes the president of the United States.
Well, I would like to know the answers to these questions because it's all up in the air. But yes, the question has a very good logic because he did, I mean, winning by 20%. That's enough. I mean, who does that today? Obviously, he is the right profile for Florida for sure, but maybe also for the nation. He is a family man. He talks to his constituents. He engages very well with the Latinos because in Florida this is a very, very critical contingent of constituents. So he made it. He just made it. And there was this very interesting sign of a shift within the Republican Party when the New York Post newspaper immediately came out with the first page of Ron DeSantis with a different name. You may have noticed this, Ron the Future. And the New York Post was the most loyal and the supportive media of President Trump until the other day. Same thing happened with Fox television, which was totally Trumpian itself as well. And that's probably a bigger sign and a more important sign. If the media decides this, then it's a serious situation for Trump. Although he did make his bid, he will run, but he will first of all have to face his own party, his own constituents. So Ron DeSantis, what I think is that he does not represent an extreme wing in the Republicans. And one more thing, going back to the elections, I think that a positive sign is that both extremes seem to have been kind of isolated. Because let's be fair and remember the letter of some 30 Democrat representatives from the House of Representatives who signed this open letter demanding that aid to Ukraine is at least reconsidered, if not totally curbed, and that immediately they were simply forced, asked to withdraw it, which they did, which means that the Democratic Party also has its own internal kind of a dissents, and both parties are coalitions of some kind, of some sort. But with the victory of this big way of DeSantis, once again, and the failure of Trump-sponsored, Trump-endorsed candidates means that the extreme of the party is kind of pushed aside, and that makes me think that Ron DeSantis may make a strong candidate. But I want to hear him on a number of matters. You remember, he never said anything on foreign policy and security policy. Even when asked the question, the only thing he said was, okay, my job is Florida. I will only talk about Florida, which is fair. But he needs to be asked more questions if he would really like to make a presidential bid. But let me tell you one more thing. Everybody knows about him, but Mike Pence may be another candidate. And he will come into such a competition, in such a race, with all the glory of honest and dignified behavior during the onslaught on Capitol Hill. He behaved as a true politician, and a true statesman, and that will bring him more points if he would decide to compete to run with the other Republican Democrats in a primary of candidates for the presidency. So it will be very interesting to watch. But my sense is that Trump, he will be there, he will be on the trail, but he won't stand the chance among his own peers to begin with.
Oh, we have a question from Martin.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the discussion and for being our guest in spite of all the obstacles. So I have two questions, and I would like to ask the second question after you answer the first one. So recently, Donald Trump revealed he's running for president again in 2024. What would that mean for the US-EU relations if he's elected for a second term? And is there the possibility of America going on the path of isolationism again? And when we're talking about it, what is actually isolationism in contemporary terms?
That's a very good question. The brief answer is yes. I fear that he would again pull America out of global issues, of international issues, because listen to what his slogans are. He's not trying to build and to enforce America's role in the world in the name of big goals like democracy, like fighting authoritarianism, like fighting populism, which is what many nations are suffering from. No, he says again, America will have to show what it's capable of. It's still not made known to the public, to the international public, what a great nation it is. So he's introversial, he's intro-focused. But that all comes, I think, from a bigger kind of flaw that he has. He views, and I'm not telling you anything new that you don't know, but he does view politics in a transactional way. he believes everything is a deal. I come to you, we strike a deal, you and I, and that resolves everything else. He did that miserably failing with North Korea, with China, with Russia. He was thinking that by probably negotiating one more high rise for himself in St. Petersburg, he would somehow also get a foreign policy success one way or another. And he's not interested in that, how should I put it, in the bigger goals. And that's the man. I mean, that's the way he's made. This is why I don't see a different Trump if he does get the presidency. And I'm telling you, I'm not making my conclusions. I'm not judging from an American point of view. I cannot. I know America very well. I like the nation. I have so many friends there, but I am who I am, and I'm more interested in how my country will fare within its European family in different kind of situations, depending on what happens in Washington, because no matter whether we like it or not, America remains a major factor in international life, and the EU recognized this extremely kind of directly, almost on our skin in the past 9 months. So yes, I do fear that America will withdraw, it will go backward if Trump makes it in 2 years' time.
Before we head to Martin's second
He had
question,
one more question, Martin.
he has one more question, but we actually have a contra question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. I'm
again, about Trump and Biden, and Adrian actually says that Biden might be preferred by the European countries, but might be preferred by you, but he's not that much NATO committed as Trump, because Trump actually recognized that most of the states do not recognize this 2% rule of the GDP. And in this point of thinking, Trump's tweets, they actually may be justified, at least as a tool to wake up NATO countries. How valid is this?
Oh, absolutely. I always try to be fair, and I knew we will come to this. Actually, we owe Trump a big deal for the 2% increase, because if he weren't that, how should I put it, abrupt, he was on the verge of, no, he was rude, not even on the verge of being. He was right away rude to NATO, to the Europeans, when he demanded that, and that's fair. I mean, that's only fair, that Europeans should also meet their own financial obligations and contribute, and at least make it up to a certain extent to the US for having maintained the organization for so many years. You remember that just months earlier, President Macron famously said that NATO is in a brain death, which really was very, very impolite. But again, he may have meant the same, to kind of shake up NATO a bit. But who did shake up NATO really was Trump. But this was not made out of concern for getting closer and continuing more closely with NATO. It was just, again, out of purely financial calculus. No, doesn't matter. I grant him this, and I'm grateful that he did it. I don't think the element of the question, which refers to countries not making it up to 2%, is totally right, because no country has said we are not going to the 2%. No, we all accepted it. We all voted in Brussels that we are taking our expenses or actually defense budgets up to 2%. Not the budgets, I'm sorry, our contributions to NATO up to 2%. But some may not have achieved the 2%, but nobody has said, no, we won't be paying this. The other thing is that obviously the last few months have indicated the importance of investing in defense. And again, I will start with Bulgaria again. I think we are in the worst possible situation compared to every country around. The only country I'm not sure of is probably Bosnia and Kosovo, but they're out of the discussion. They're not NATO countries, and it's a different story there. But among all NATO member states, Bulgaria is the most vulnerable in terms of national capacity, national defense capacity. So we will be spending more, inevitably, and that's what going to happen to most of the countries. So again, if President Trump wants to get more money of us, yeah, he's succeeded to do this. But I think that Europeans are more interested in political goals, in philosophy, in mid and long-term goals, rather than collecting the money as a tax collector.
And now heading to the second question from Martin.
Yes, so on the topic of the midterms again, I'm interested in the consequences. What does the victory of the Democratic Party in the Senate mean for Joe Biden's remaining time as president? And is there a threat to his administration with the loss of his party in the House of Representatives?
No, the first thing that matters to him personally, I would say, is that even if the House starts an investigation for impeachment, which they will most probably do, depending now, that will be an interesting moment here. Because definitely a number of Republicans threatened investigation for impeachment of President Biden if they would get the House. So they get it, and now they can do exactly what the Democrats did to President Trump. They can start an investigation against him, but it will go nowhere because of the majority, even by one vote. That maximum 2, but I don't know that yet, which Democrats have in the Senate. But by the way, no sitting president has ever been impeached in America for different reasons. One may have been, and that's Nixon, but he wisely and very prudently left office before being really impeached, because that was bad. But Clinton didn't, Johnson before him didn't, so I don't think Trump didn't, so I don't think there's much into this. But it does mean that from a procedural point of view, this cannot happen. Other things may happen though. The House may easily go against some of the decisions made by the administration. It will mostly have to do with financial matters, budget matters, because they can really stop legislation or executive orders coming from the president. Of course, the Senate may overrule certain things, but it won't be an easy time for an easy 2 years for Biden. What they may do, which is on a bipartisan level, it is an energy permitting reform. They may actually agree, the Republicans, I mean, agree to a reform which will further anchor the United States as a major conventional and clean energy superpower. Because the United States is totally self-sufficient now in terms of energy. You see, they export, which is, by the way, also due to natural gas, to the drilling they did, and they're totally self-sufficient. So that can be a positive, because Republicans will be equally interested in kind of establishing. There is business attached to it, you know. In every state there's energy business, so that can somehow make them all agree on some energy matters. Well, climate will be more difficult, of course, because, as I said, as previously happened, they would demand responsible behavior on the part of bigger polluters like India and China, which will be hard to achieve. So that's one positive which I see, and I do think that they will stay more or less bipartisan on Ukraine, because they've been bipartisan so far, even with the democratic dominance of the House and the Senate. Now it will be even easier. You remember, you may not, I don't know, Mitch McConnell, who is still the current minority leader in the Senate, he used to criticize Biden for doing too little, too late for Ukraine. He demanded, as a minority leader in the Senate, that aid should be expanded. Well, we'll see now how they will act, but I wouldn't be surprised if, even for the sake of embarrassing Biden, they might demand of him to do more than has been done so far. But basically, I don't see any rift on Ukraine. China is another one which has always been bipartisan.
We have one more question in the chat section. We are going back to Brussels now. How do you see the future of European policy towards the United States? Will there be a more independent approach? And I think this is the interesting part of the question. And do European countries even want a more independent approach to the United States?
But that's a very important question. It's a key question. Now, I would, if you look at the political level, everything goes in favor of a more integrated relationship with the US. Now, Stefan, you will excuse me, but I'll need to move because of this funny outlet I'm using, my phone. I need to move closer to my charger. I don't want you to lose me at an inappropriate moment. So I'm just putting, yeah. It did say low battery. Whoops. Okay, here we are. So let me. It's not an accident that I started my remarks with the Marshall Plan. There is so much mutual connectivity between America and Europe. It goes in trade, it goes in science, in education, not to speak of defense and security and defense industries. I would, in brackets here, I would say, I'm sure you would have noticed the French proposal when Macron expected to kind of somehow automatically take on the role of Chancellor Merkel, but it didn't work exactly that way. But he was very, very ambitious and very hopeful that he will now be the new leader of Europe. So what happened was that he invented the strategic autonomy concept of Europe. Have you heard of this strategic concept lately? Because I have not. The problem is that it's a beautiful idea and a beautiful concept as well. I worked on a working group. I was on a working group which analyzed this, which was a European working group. And when we came down to the specifics, then it was kind of at least a number of unknowns. Strategic autonomy from whom and for what? This is the big question, and that has not found its answer as yet. Okay, if we want to be autonomous in defense or security, we cannot do it. Europe, there is one other thing which I kept remembering whenever this idea of the strategic autonomy was raised, because it has to do with defense mostly. There was a West European Union. I think it died before you guys were born. But this was decided back, it was started sometime in the 70s, I believe. It was under General de Gaulle, who was very much in favor of sovereign, autonomous France, Vive la France, and that's spectacular. I really admire him a great deal. So in those years, the West European Union was born, which was supposed to be the defense arm of the European community at the time. So it did exist as a nice club of discussions, but it never produced anything practical, because what you need to do is just make sure that you've got all the technology, all the electronics, all the manpower, everything which many countries in Europe are still lacking in. Germany, okay, but even Germany is not sure if that's that if they can do it alone. I would suggest, and also this colleague of yours who asked the question, follow the German statements on this matter, on the bond with America. Because if I tell you, yes, it's an essential and it's an indispensable bond. We may not like it always, but it's indispensable. But if I tell you this, you will say, of course, we know she's a NATO guy or gal. she's a pro-American, etc. No, I'm just trying to be practical in terms of my own country's ability to be relatively powerful, relatively independent. So please watch what the Germans are saying lately, and they tell you this, that that there is no way of decoupling between Europe and the US for very practical reasons. It's not just a blindfolded infatuation or something, or pro-Americanism for its own sake. Not at all. It's a really practical outlook and practical thinking in terms of all the risks and challenges Europe is facing. Because you know what, that applies for Bulgaria as well. Like most Bulgarians, I get easily angry. One team comes after the other, and I'm always unhappy. And I say, no, these didn't do anything. The next ones will do. I found out, guys, and I don't want to be pessimistic, but just would like to hear also your thinking, your take on this. I think that our problem is mostly cultural before becoming political. We tend to mix up cultural kind of quality and power and strengths, rather, not power, strengths, trying to replace them somehow by kind of empty political phrases. And I think that this is the cultural bond that exists between Europe and America. And this cultural bond will stay forever. It's there. It's down in the guts of Europeans and Americans. We may argue on the supra level, on the active intellectual level, but in our stomachs, in our guts, we belong to the same way of perceiving the world, the same way of wanting things for ourselves. And that's what matters the most, I think.
I think this is the time to recommend Georgi Gospodinov's last book, Time Shelter. For those who have already read it, I see a smiling face. We don't have actually a lot of time, and that's why moving to the end of our talk, I would be very happy if you tell us a story, because you were living in Washington. You for surely know at least 2 American presidents. How are policymakers in real life?
Oh, they're very different people, because they're people. At the end of the day, they're also people. Actually, I'll tell you, I happen to know more American presidents than one would imagine, because Oh my God, I was just beginning my work at MFA when I happened to meet President Carter. I was the last name on the list of the delegation of Lyudmila Zhivkova at the time. I was only 23 years old when she had this very important visit to the US. I think they were curious to see this woman who was speaking differently, looking at trying to make things different in her own way. I'm not now arguing anything pro or against, but I'm saying that she got this meeting with Carter because in the White House, because yeah, they wanted to, and that's how actually some educational systems, new educational systems came to Bulgaria as a result of that visit. So it was mostly education, but nobody mentioned at the time, because of the political expediency there, the political rules of the time, it was never mentioned that she met with President Carter. Then the same famous / notorious President Nixon, he came after being president, after having been president, he came for a one-on-one meeting with Zhivkov, with Todor Zhivkov, and he came from Romania, and I was interpreting, and it was really one-on-one. So I had to reproduce the meeting afterwards in an aid memoir, which was some 14 pages long. And you know that I should boast now here. No, it's not even a boast. It was such a pleasant surprise when I first arrived in Washington. Somebody told me, well, you know, Madam Ambassador, your aid memoir of the meeting between President Nixon and Bulgaria's leader Todor Zhivkov is now kept at the Wilson Center's library, which was amazing. So I had it pulled out, and I have it with me, which is translated into English. So that was President number 2. Then President Clinton, when he came to Bulgaria, but this was a very kind of very fleeting impression. There were crowds around, and I was nobody. I was just an ordinary member of parliament, and no way of getting closer, but still out there on the square. And then there was President Bush, of course, who was a very, you know what, this is maybe true of all presidents, which is, but it has to do with the American nature. You know that they're very unassuming, unpretentious. They strike out very easy relationship. So when I presented my credentials to President Bush, my husband was in hospital. He had his first big medical challenge. So it was just me and my son, who was 13 years old at the time. And because the Americans, they invite you with your family to go to the ceremony, and they make a difference. This is an exception to other protocol rules in other countries. So there we were, and my son, who didn't speak much of English, he only said, "Hello, sir, I'm George too." And he liked it very much. And for all next 5-6 years, practically, whenever he would see me, and I'm tall, I'm visible, he would just wave a hand and say, "How's George?" And I would only show how much higher George has become. And he did turn out to be a very tall young man. So, and then he would ask, where is he going to school? Things like that. He would ask of my husband. That's a very kind of personable approach. With President Obama, I remember, oh my God, I will be sharing now things with you which I've never mentioned. Please keep this confidential. As I told you, my husband, he unfortunately early in life had some serious issues, and we were there starting a meeting. We were literally at the door of the Oval Office, waiting to be ushered in for this meeting with President Obama. And I always keep my phone open, ringing or muted, but always in service. And I see he's calling out from home, from the residence. And I immediately think, oh my God, something might have happened. So I quietly go into a corner and very quietly I say, "What's going on?" And he goes, "There's no bread in the house." I didn't. What do you do? I wanted to strangle him, and then I said, "No, I better hang myself, because it's me who should know that there should be no phones there. President Obama, he really, I first actually saw him at a convention of the Democratic Party. He was only a state senator, just beginning his big political career. And he was invited to be one of the speakers at the National Democratic Convention. And I'm telling you, it is, you know what, he just sucks you in. Such energy, such flame. He was shining. I mean, he had it all. But again, when you come to the presidency itself, it's not just glamour or glamour, as some would say. He's always been that. But when it comes to practical decisions, you may need less glamour, but more decisiveness, because he did a few very kind of faux pas when he hesitated about making a couple of decisions, which have about Syria, let me tell you right away, which brings consequences to this very day. But again, as I say, a glamorous personality. I visited President Trump in Mar-a-Lago twice on his invitation. I was already back, so I don't know him as president, but I knew him as Donald Trump, the entrepreneur, and this absolutely fabulous estate, Mar-a-Lago. I don't know how, it was just 3 or 4 of us ambassadors from the region. He was already married to Melania. He was expecting her first child the first time. And there was an International Red Cross festival there, or something, big event, gala. So we were transported by his personal plane, which had gilded, literally gilded taps, water taps, everything metal in the plane was gilded. And then he had, oh my God, he had the Impressionists hanging around, 18th century Impressionists, the originals, like that. So that was quite an interesting encounter. And I'm amused by him as a private individual. What I don't like is his European policy. So this is it. President Biden I've known for many years when he was a senator, and he was chairman of the Foreign Policy Committee. He's the popular guy, the people's guy. He would always be smiling and shaking and hugging, and yeah, and and that has become his first nature already. This is what he's been doing for the last 50 years. I only wish him good health to cover well the remainder of his term. He also said, but very, very modestly, very cautiously, he said he might be running, but that's yet to see. So anyway, it's a fascinating country with a lot to see, a lot to learn. And maybe let me finish by one thing. Americans may be ignorant about many things. They may be too much the missionaries. They want to do good. No matter whether you want it or not, they want to do good. But they're not the enemy. They are not the enemy. And I will finish by something just as of yesterday, because I've been speaking to different TV stations at home about the incident with the missiles in Poland. You remember that it was Biden who first said, "Keep cool, keep your cool. We don't know how did all this happen. Don't point a finger at Russia." So they can do that. They can be less ideological than sometimes we expect them to be.
And on this note, we may sum up that if there is no bread in the house, don't call your wife, just buy some. It was a great pleasure to host you, and I think it was a very interesting meeting. I want especially to thank Ms. Poптodorova for joining us and for accepting our invitation, of course. Our next seminar is going to be dedicated to the future relations between Russia and Western countries, and it's going to be with Marlene Laruelle and our own Fedor Lukyanov. I remind you that the opinions you heard belong to those who say them and not the club or the laboratory or the university And thank you all for participating. Thank you all for your questions, and hope to see you soon on our next seminar. It's going to be the 29th of November. So bye, have a nice night and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Thank you.